Hello. For this module, I am going to talk about how the international human rights regime addresses the adverse human rights situations brought about by climate change. There are generally two classes of human rights mechanisms that could address issues on climate change and its impact on human rights: the UN-based and treaty-based mechanisms. So first, the UN-based mechanism. As members of the UN Charter, states parties submit to the Human Rights Council country reports for this body's review. But more than this, the Human Rights Council is also tasked to monitor human rights conditions in the UN member states. UN-based. So the first mechanism is UN-based, which is mainly the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body within the UN system, made up of 47 states responsible for the promotion and protection of all human rights around the globe. The Council was created by the United Nations General Assembly in 2006. Among its mechanisms are the Universal Periodic Review, where the Council assesses the human rights situations of all UN member states, and the complaint procedure, which allows individuals and organizations to bring human rights violations to the attention of the Council. The Human Rights Council also works with the UN Special Procedures, made up of special rapporteurs, special representatives, independent experts, and working groups that monitor, examine, advise, and publicly report on thematic issues on human rights situations in specific countries. The Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, composed of 18 experts, has also been established to function as a think tank for the Council and work at its discretion. Now, the Human Rights Council also issues resolutions. Some examples of the Human Rights Council's expression of concern regarding human rights and climate change are the following. The Human Rights and Climate Change resolution, wherein the Human Rights Council decided to incorporate into its program of work for the 5th session a panel discussion focusing on the adverse impact of climate change on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights by people in vulnerable situations, and best practices and lessons learned in the promotion and protection of rights of people in vulnerable situations. The Human Rights Council also decided to incorporate into its annual program of work, beginning in 2023, sufficient time at a minimum a panel discussion to discuss different themes on the adverse impacts of climate change on human rights. It also requested the Secretary General to submit to the Human Rights Council at its 50th session a report on the adverse impact of climate change on the full and effective enjoyment of human rights of people in vulnerable situations. In a resolution in October 2021, the Council decided to appoint for a period of 3 years a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change with the following mandate, which I will only mention the first two: to study and identify how the adverse effects of climate change, including sudden and slow onset disasters, affect the full and effective enjoyment of human rights and make recommendations on how to address and prevent these adverse effects, and to identify existing challenges and make recommendations regarding respect for and promotion of human rights, including in the context of the design and implementation of the mitigation and adaptation policies, practices, investments, and other projects. The Council also requested the Advisory Committee to conduct a study and to prepare a report on the impact of the new technologies for climate protection on the enjoyment of human rights. The Special Rapporteurs. The appointment of special rapporteurs is not new to the Human Rights Council. Although this is the first time that a special rapporteur has been appointed specifically for climate change, there have been observations from past special rapporteurs who have already expressed concern for climate change. Some examples are Indonesia, the report of the Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Accordingly, extreme weather events caused by climate change have affected the country, claiming the lives of people and depriving individuals of their right to food and livelihood. The impact of climate change and extreme weather conditions particularly affect the right to food of fisherfolk and coastal communities. The government's climate change and disaster response policies should fully integrate the right to food. According to the report, this effort should afford special attention to those who are especially vulnerable, including farmers, fisherfolk, rural populations, and coastal communities, and take into account a gender perspective. Another is the report of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. On his mission to the Philippines, the rapporteur said that no country could be prepared for the devastating impact of an event such as Typhoon Haiyan, which tragically demonstrated that the Philippines is on the front line of climate change-related extreme weather events. The government and people must be commended for their extraordinary resilience and efforts to rebuild devastated infrastructure and communities. However, 2 years on, it appears that attention and resources required to achieve durable solutions for persons internally displaced by Haiyan are waning. For a country prone to disasters and enduring long-standing conflicts, it is vital to translate international standards, including the 1998 Guiding Principles on Internal Displacements and the Framework on Durable Solutions for Internally Displaced Persons, into domestic law. Another mechanism is the liaison with independent experts. Part of the special procedures of the Council is appointing independent human rights experts with mandates to report on advice on human rights from a thematic or country-specific perspective, including situation of vulnerable sectors. So some examples are the independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons. Accordingly, the changing climate is already affecting the subsisting farmer livelihood system and human well-being in north-central Namibia. There is need for an in-depth analysis and mapping of persons in vulnerable situations, especially older persons. In emergency situations, information on the humanitarian response and on the provision of services and support must be adopted to the specific needs and conditions of older persons, drawing upon existing standards, guidelines, and best practices such as the Interagency Standing Committee, operational guidelines on the protection of persons in situations of natural disasters, the Peninsula Principles on Climate Displacement within states, and the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. Another is the visit to Qatar, the independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, which welcomed the state's participation in relevant international fora, but stresses the need for Qatar to do more to reorient its policies and activities towards combating climate change systematically, and it concluded that the government must make a paradigm shift in the state's approach to combating climate change, away from reliance on natural gas and towards a greater use of renewable energy. In so doing, Qatar will strengthen the commitments laid out in the Qatar National Vision 2030 program and the Sustainable Development Goals. Working groups. Working groups monitor, examine, advise, and publicly report on thematic issues on human rights situations in specific countries. For example, the report of the Working Group on the Right to Development. It held an interactive dialogue with experts on the implementation and realization of the right to development and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Vicente Yu addressed challenges for the realization of the right to development and the 2030 Agenda, especially climate change and global economic uncertainty. Accordingly, climate vulnerabilities depended on countries' state of development, infrastructure, finances, and technology. A legally binding instrument on the right to development could consider climate change. Achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement required ambitious climate action, the availability of adaptation technologies, and transition to clean energy and reduced energy demand. Regina Asariotis, Senior Legal Affairs Officer and Chief of the Policy and Legislation Section of the Division on Technology and Logistics on the UN Conference on Trade and Development, referred to climate change as the defining issue in our era. She noted that small islands developing states were highly vulnerable to external shocks with a high exposure to natural disasters and limited adaptability capacity. Research showed that the airports and seaports of small island developing states were vulnerable under all climate change scenarios, illustrating the urgency of taking action. So the second mechanism is treaty-based. Addressing the adverse human rights situations brought about by climate change can be through issuances of general recommendations, general comments by the Committee of Experts, which articulates the meaning of treaty provisions, concluding observations on country reports, and inquiry and communication procedures where countries agreed to be bound by said procedures. So as example, General Recommendation number 37 on CEDAW on the gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. The committee has underlined that states parties and other stakeholders have obligations to take specific steps to address discrimination against women in the fields of disaster risk reduction and climate change through the adoption of targeted laws, policies, mitigation and adaptation strategies, budgets, and other measures. In its statement on gender and climate change, the committee outlined that all stakeholders should ensure that climate change and disaster risk reduction measures were gender responsive and sensitive to indigenous knowledge systems, that they respected human rights. The right of women to participate at all levels of decision-making must be guaranteed in climate change policies and programs. Another is the ICE-SCR General Comment number 15 on the right to water. Accordingly, states parties should adopt comprehensive and integrated strategies and policies and programs to ensure that there is sufficient and safe water for present and future generations. Such strategies and programs may include, among others, assessing the impact of actions that may impinge upon water availability and natural ecosystems, watersheds such as climate changes, desertification and increased soil salinity, deforestation, and loss of biodiversity, increasing the efficient use of water by end users, reducing water wastage in its distribution, response mechanisms for emergency situations, and establishing competent institution and appropriate institutional arrangements to carry out the strategies and program. Another is General Comment number 15 on the Committee on the Rights of the Child. This is about the enjoyment of the child of the highest attainable standard of health. Accordingly, there is also a growing understanding of the impact of climate change and rapid urbanization on children's health. The committee draws attention to the relevance of the environment beyond environmental pollution to children's health. Environmental intervention should, among others, address climate change, as this is one of the biggest threats to children's health and exacerbates health disparities. States should therefore put children's health concerns at the center of their climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies. And then we have General Comment number 36 by the Committee on Civil and Political Rights on the right to life. Accordingly, Environmental degradation, climate change, and unsustainable development constitute some of the most pressing and serious threat to the ability of present and future generations to enjoy the right to life. State parties should therefore ensure sustainable use of natural resources, develop and implement substantive environmental standards, conduct environmental impact assessments, and consult with relevant states about activities likely to have significant impact on the environment, provide notification to other states concerned and are about natural disasters and emergencies, and cooperate with them, provide appropriate access to information on environmental hazards, and pay due regard to the precautionary approach. Another mechanism or monitoring mechanism are concluding observations. Here we have the CEDAW on the concluding observation on the report of the Lao Democratic Republic and also on Cambodia, both on the issue of women participation. For Lao, the committee said that it recommends that the state party ensure the participation of women in the preparation, adoption, and implementation of national policies and programs on climate change, disaster response, and risk reduction, and include an explicit gender perspective in such policies. It also recommends that the state party increase sustainability, the number of women in related decision-making bodies, including the National Committee for Natural Disaster Prevention and Control. For Cambodia, the committee expresses concern that women, in particular, women living in rural areas, are excluded from participation in the formulation and implementation of policies and action plans on climate change and disaster risk reduction, even though they are disproportionately affected by the effects of climate change and disaster, as women in the state party are more likely to depend on agriculture than men. Then we have the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination on its concluding observations in El Salvador. It notes that the state party, through its Agrarian Reform Institute, keeps a land register for rural persons, but no information on land tenure by indigenous peoples or persons of African descent. The committee is also concerned about difficulties in accessing water scarcity, and the presence of gangs that aggravate the situation. It recommends to maintain and strengthen the dialogue between the Ministry of the Environment and indigenous peoples organizations, in particular on policies to deal with climate crisis. Then we have the International Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights on its concluding observations with Norway. Accordingly, the committee is concerned about the licenses the state party has issued in recent years for the exploration and exploitation of petroleum and natural gas reserves in the Arctic Ocean and the Barents Sea, and the impact of those activities on global warming. The committee recommends that the state party intensify its efforts to achieve its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions by at least 50% and towards 55% compared to 1990 levels by 2030, and to promote alternative and renewable energy resources. It also recommends that the state party reconsider its decision to increase oil and natural gas exploitation and takes its human rights obligation as a primary consideration in its natural resource exploitation and export policies. Then you have the Committee of the Rights of the Child on its concluding observations with Mozambique. Accordingly, they recommend that Mozambique ensure that the specific vulnerabilities and needs of children, as well as their views, are taken into account in the development of policies and programs addressing the issues of climate change and disaster risk management. Increase children's awareness of and preparedness for climate change and natural disasters by incorporating these issues into the school curriculum and teacher training programs. Then we also have the concluding observations by the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities in Seychelles. So it recommends that the state party continue efforts to ensure inclusion of disability rights perspective in the disaster risk management. It also recommends that the state party ensure that the requirements of persons with disabilities are included in the design, implementation of all disaster risk reduction and management plans and climate change adaptation, providing for a single point of contact in situations of emergency and disasters in accordance with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And finally, you have an individual communication as a mechanism where an individual can file a case for violation of human rights under a treaty where the state being sued is a state party to both the main treaty and its protocol on communications procedure. In this case against New Zealand, the author claims that the effects of climate change and sea level rise forced him to migrate to the island of Tarawa in Kiribati, to New Zealand. The situation in Tarawa has become increasingly unstable and precarious due to sea level rise caused by global warming. Fresh water has become scarce because of saltwater contamination and overcrowding on Tarawa. Kiribati has thus become an untenable and violent environment, according to the author, for him and his family. So he sought asylum in New Zealand, but the Immigration and Protection Tribunal issued a negative decision concerning his claim for asylum. Nevertheless, the tribunal did not exclude the possibility that environmental degradation could create pathways into the Refugee Convention on Protected Person jurisdiction. In the present case, the committee accepts that the author's claim that sea level rise is likely to render the Republic of Kiribati uninhabitable. The committee is of the view that without robust national and international efforts, the effects of climate change in receiving states may expose individuals in violation of their right under Articles 6 and 7 of the Covenant, thereby triggering the non-refoulement obligation of sending states. However, it notes that the time frame of 10 to 15 years, as suggested by the author, could allow for intervening acts by the Republic of Kiribati with the assistance of international community to take affirmative measures to protect and, where necessary, relocate its population. So without prejudice to the continuing responsibility of the state party to take into account in future deportation cases, the situation at the time in Kiribati, and new updated data on the effects of climate change and rising sea levels thereupon, the committee is not in a position to hold that the author's right under Article 6 of the Covenant were violated upon his deportation to Kiribati in 2015. Okay, so I have hopefully given you a glimpse of how human rights mechanisms can be used to address climate change issues and challenges. Thank you.